In 1970, the average UK home cost a little over £4,000. In 2023, that number has gone up more than 6,000% to £280,000 in 50 years. And I think everyone knows that house prices have outstripped inflation, wage growth, population growth during that time. This has led to something of a housing crisis, not just in the UK, but in much of the Western world, which is suffering from the same problem. For many people, owning a home may seem like a distant dream or unachievable altogether, but I want to ask, why? Why have house prices gone up so much over the last 50 years? And there are a few candidates that commentators like to put forward. Is it overcrowding of the country from immigration and population growth? Is it too many landlords owning residential properties and driving up prices? Is it that there are too many houses bought by previous generations at much better prices? Is it that interest rates are at an all-time low, making mortgages easier to get and driving up house prices? Or is it simply that we've not been building enough houses? Perhaps that house builders are sat on too much land, or because planning restrictions are too harsh? Before we get into it, I want to ask what you think. Do you think it's one of those reasons, or something else? And I'm going to talk about all of those suppositions and give you an answer. This is your full context on house prices. For those of you who don't know, I'm Tim. I trained as a chartered accountant at some of the biggest firms in the world and retired age 33. I now work as a full-time investor and make videos about the things I'm asked about the most. As we get into this, remember that I'm going to give you figures from the UK housing market as a whole, and when we're talking about the country as a whole, we're using averages. In some pockets of the country, house prices may be falling or rising at different speeds. At certain times in the last 50 years, house price growth in some areas of London has been so fast that some people were making more money from house price appreciation than from their salary. But we're taking a long-term view of the country. This also applies to many other Western countries whose metrics will be very similar to the UK. But first, let's talk about population growth. In the 1970s, the UK population was 56 million. In 2023, the population was 67 million, and that 11 million increase is around a 20% increase in 50 years. And clearly a higher population has a higher demand for housing. So how many houses did we build in that same time? Now, the term we're going to use instead of houses is dwellings, because this covers houses as well as apartments, bungalows, maisonettes, or anything else that we live in. In 1970, we had 18 million dwellings, and in 2023, there were 30 million dwellings. That 12 million increase is a whopping 65%. So not only did housing stock increase 3 times faster than the population, but we built the equivalent of more than one house or dwelling for every new member of the population. There are a few things to unpack from this, but I think it's abundantly clear that the increasing population has not caused house prices to increase. After all, we've built so many more houses in this time frame. Now, I'm using official statistics here, and some people might want to talk about unknown or illegal immigrants in the country, and they do exist. Obviously, there's no good way to measure or know how big this number might be. But you can't with a straight face tell me that there are 10 or 20 million illegal immigrants in the UK, making up maybe 20% of the population, because this is how large it would have to be for the population to have grown just at the same rate as house building. I was able to find a few measures that are placing it at 1 or 2 million, which is nowhere near enough to skew our conclusions here. Because we have built so many more new houses than we have had an increase in population, that means we have actually, on average, far fewer people in each house. In 1970, there were an average of 3 people per household, and in 2023, that number has fallen 25% to 2.25 people per household. And this gives us an interesting insight into the change in social dynamics over the last 50 years. There are many more people living alone. 50 years ago, it was far less common to move away from the family home as a single person to work in another city. 50 years ago, it was more common for the family unit to stay together longer until you could afford to buy a house. This would mean young couples who get married may live with parents until they can afford to leave. And perhaps this has changed over the last 50 years because, on average, we are richer. I know that doesn't feel that way given we are permanently pummeled with the news that we're also poor, but the data simply doesn't support that. Over the last 50 years, median wage growth has almost doubled that of inflation over the same period. For instance, in 1970, the median wage was around £1,000 per year, and let's say the annual shopping bill at the time would be £100. In 2023, the median wage is now £30,000 per year, and your shopping is £2,000. Wages have increased 30 times, and the shopping has only increased 20 times. Remember, this is just a for instance. If your wages have gone up by more than the cost of goods, that means you have more money to spend. And for many people, they're choosing to spend that extra money on housing. In some cases, that's living alone or living as a couple quicker than before, away from parents. And because more people are able to do this, more people want to do this. And because more people want to do this, even more people want to do this because the UK feeds the keeping up with the Joneses mentality, and even fewer people want to live with parents for longer. This of course creates more demand, which drives up prices. So, more demand because more people want to move away from the family home quicker, more people wanting to move out quicker because they can afford it more easily, and they can afford it more easily because they, on average, have more money than 50 years ago. And this is why the government sets house building targets every year, because there is demand. But that demand is not being caused by an increasing population, it's being caused by a wealthier population who want to spend more of their money on housing. I don't want to get into the weeds of the average wealth and living standards of the country, but if you need some convincing, talk to your parents or grandparents about their living standards compared to yours. Did they have to scrimp and save for a holiday in the UK, or could they go on an all-inclusive to Spain? Did they have central heating, double glazing, an inside toilet? What car did they drive? Obviously some, but not all of this is funded by consumer debt at a national level, but I think it's pretty clear that living standards now are so much higher and show how far you can make your money go is way further than 50 years ago. By the way, we shouldn't be underestimating how good the standard of houses is in the UK. 50 years ago, many houses did not have central heating, double glazing, an inside toilet, heat insulation, or sometimes even running water. In 1975, 1 million homes were rated as slums, and almost 2 million were deemed unfit for habitation, lacking these basic amenities. And these things all cost money. New homes are all required to have these basic standards, as well as many more, such as gas and fire safety. These increased housing standards have of course led to the cost of house building, and therefore the cost of houses, to increase. But again, this is not a significant driver overall. After all, the Public Health Act of 1875 made running water and drainage a legal requirement for new homes. It just took more than 100 years to improve the existing housing stock, in no small part due to 2 world wars. But why is it then that we can't meet house building targets? Well, firstly because the numbers are more or less plucked out of thin air. But many would tell you it's because planning permission to build is so restrictive. And they're right. As a property investor myself, I can tell you firsthand how difficult it is to build anything. Sometimes it can be hard to convert an unused building into new dwellings, despite some efforts to change things. And you don't have to take my word for this. If you've watched Clarkson's Farm on Amazon, you'll see a first-hand account of the difficulties he's had running a farm shop and converting a disused barn on his own land. And I do think that relaxed planning permissions would help build more houses. Of course it would. And that you can help bring down house prices simply by increasing supply. But this alone wouldn't move the needle. Our house building targets are around 1% increase in housing every year, but house prices have gone up on average more than 8% every year over the last 50 years. As you can see here, the house price increase far outstrips wage growth, inflation, population, and house building. So finally, what about interest rates? Since the credit crunch of 2008, rates have been at historic lows across most of the Western world. In theory, low rates make mortgages lower, making buying a house more accessible, and therefore increasing house prices. Following the initial house price crash, prices have risen by an average of 4% per year. But prior to that, in a higher interest rate environment, the price increase was even larger, around 11% per year. How does that make sense? Low interest rates are supposed to increase house prices, and these low rates have helped to keep the housing market high following the crash of 2008, but house prices are rising much slower than they were in the 40 years prior. Let's have a chat about landlords. Are there significantly more landlords now than 50 years ago? The short answer is no. In 1970, we have around 20% of our houses being privately rented, and in 2020, that hasn't really changed. That number did fall through the 70s and 80s, but then rose again. So we have seen a rise in landlords over the last 30 years, but it is at a similar level to 50 years ago. And what's clear is that almost all houses were rented 100 years ago, and home ownership is extremely attainable by that comparison. And I don't want to discuss the morality around being a landlord. This show is full context, not a discussion on ethics, but we should bear in mind that some people want to rent and some people need to rent for different reasons. So there is at least a non-zero number of rental properties that we as a population want. Anecdotally, as a property investor, I see more demand for renting than I do for buying. and nothing we've looked at seems to be significant enough to increase house prices by as much as we have seen. It's clear that house price growth has far outstripped all the metrics we have looked at, and it's because house prices, wage growth, inflation all have a much bigger player, causing these things to go up more significantly over the last 50 years, and that is money printing. You see, in this video I've told you that since 1970, inflation has made the price of goods go up by 20 times. Median wages have gone up 30 times. Median house prices have gone up 65 times. But the amount of money, the amount of pounds sterling in circulation, has gone up by 115 times. Money printing is what creates wage growth. Printing money is what creates inflation in the cost of goods, and printing money is what causes asset prices to rise. When you print money, it can get into the economy in a whole host of different ways depending on where it's distributed. During the COVID lockdowns, huge amounts of money were printed and much of it was distributed to people via furlough payments. This was a lifeline for many, but others actually made a profit, either because their living expenses were reduced as well or for some other reasons. Either way, the economy had more pounds in it. This caused sharp increases in house prices in 2021 and 2022, even after the temporary stamp duty relief ended. It's also what caused the huge inflation spikes in 2022 and 2023. In other times, money is printed to support the ongoing cost of a large public sector, employing more people who can spend, save, or invest money. Regardless of how government money printing is distributed, it is either spent, saved, or invested. When invested, this creates demand for whatever you're investing in, say property. When spent, this increases demand for whatever you're buying, increasing the cost of goods and subsequently and necessarily wages. This is clearly a very simplistic and oversimplified model of what happens when we print money, but in the round, this is exactly what happens. Some of the money gets invested, forcing assets up, and some of that money gets spent and continues to circulate in the economy, forcing up prices and wages. And the economy is a complicated thing. You don't print money today and see inflation tomorrow. You don't raise interest rates today and see house prices fall tomorrow. Much of the time, there are not only time lags, but other events that create noise. For instance, when we saw the inflation spike in 2022, we were told it was only transient inflation because of the war in Ukraine. And I have no doubt that the war did have and is still having some impact on the price of energy and grains in particular, but it was not transient. It was not the main driver of inflation. The main driver of inflation and the increase in house prices was the huge amount of money printed because of lockdowns. If you want to know more about inflation over the last 2 years, Sasha Yanshin has made some excellent videos breaking down all the nitty-gritty of inflation numbers, so I would highly recommend watching those videos. But there is a devil hiding in the bushes here, because people who own assets, whether that's property, stocks, or anything else, are typically quite wealthy. If you watch my previous video on taxing billionaires, you'll remember that 50% of the country's wealth is owned by the top 10% of the population, and money printing increases the value of assets they have, whilst the money saved by most of the population stays the same in monetary terms. £1,000 is still £1,000 because the price of goods inflates. £1,000 buys you less. You can think of it like this. If the price of apples is £10 a box, person A has £1,000 in cash, he can buy 100 boxes. Person B has £1,000 of shares, he could sell for the 100 boxes of apples. Now, if inflation was 10%, the price of apples is now £11 a box. Person A still has £1,000 in cash, but he can now only buy 90 boxes of apples. Person B sees the share value inflate to £1,100, and he can still sell his shares for 100 boxes of apples. So printing money only serves to make the rich richer and the poor poorer, because the rich typically own assets. This is no secret. Investors know and understand this. Pretty much any investor would tell you that investing in assets for the long term is a much better idea than saving. Robert Kiyosaki wrote maybe the world's best-selling personal finance book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, in 1997. In that book, he explained just this. Savers will lose out because printing money is effectively taxing the population, whereas buying assets will ensure your money does not inflate away. Well, what can you do with this information? The first thing to know is that governments will probably never stop printing money. This has been the case throughout all of the history of money, when emperors would shave gold coins or make coins with less gold content. That means that inflation, wage growth, house price growth, and stock market growth will certainly go up over the long term, so long as we keep printing money. That doesn't mean we can't see ups and downs and spikes and falls. There are many market forces and time lags that mean in the years to come we will see huge growth and some will see huge slumps. Lots of influencers and commentators will tell you of impending crashes or upcoming booms, and whilst they might turn out to be right, we should remember that no one can actually see the future, and the long-term trends will probably look the same as the last 50 years. And finally, we're not going to debate what the government spends its money on, but we should acknowledge that we are spending more than we bring in taxes, which is what is causing the money printing and increasing debt levels. If we didn't spend more than we made, we wouldn't need to print the money, we wouldn't have regular inflation, we wouldn't need to increase wages every year to keep up with inflation, and house prices wouldn't continue to rise consistently every single year. And maybe you are wealthy, maybe you own assets, maybe you own houses and you want the inflation and the money printing to continue because it's making you richer. I get it. The reason I own property is because I know it will keep going up. I know wages will keep going up, and I know because of those two things, I know rent will keep going up. But fundamentally, I have an issue with this. Government overspending is seen as necessary and benevolent because we need to pay for a world of good causes. We need to pay for social programs, state pensions, the health service, you name it. But in order to pay for it, printing money is making it harder to buy a house and more expensive to rent, making everyone's living costs more expensive. But this only really impacts the least well-off in society, because the wealthiest continue to see their asset prices rise and their wealth stays intact. Earlier in this video, I said that median wage growth had outstripped inflation, and by a significant amount. This is true only because the retail price index does not include housing costs. So whilst on average people have more money to spend on housing, it also means that the cost of housing has increased. The IFS reports poverty rates have increased due to the increased housing cost for the poorest quartile, and now accounts for a much larger proportion of disposable income compared to 50 years ago. So the next time a politician wants to spend money, or the next time you see an unbalanced government budget, consider who is really paying for that. Because in almost all cases, the money printed to pay for that will ensure that the wealthiest continue to see their wealth grow as a result of government overspending. Printing money therefore taxes both the poorest and the middle classes over time in order to pay for the government overspending. If you like this video, let me know and tell me in the comments what you think. This has been your full context on house prices.